again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining in for this session of DOSCO Talks. I'm simply delighted to have Kanti Bajpai here with us today. As you all know, and I think you're all terribly excited to hear from him, Kanti is the Wilmar Professor of Asian Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. And of course, he was our headmaster from 2003 to 2009. He's been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, the Australian Defence Force Academy, and the Joan Kroc Institute, which is the University of Notre Dame. He was a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Defence Studies and Analysis in New Delhi as well. And most recently, this is what we're very excited to talk about today, he's the author of India versus China, Why They Are Not Friends. And I have to tell you personally, I'm very excited to talk about this today. It's so topical. It's something that I'm sure we have views about. So please do pepper in your questions either on the Q&A section or on the chat. And we're going to make this as interactive as possible. I also want to thank Ashish Mitter to 15K. Excellent. Good. I'm delighted to have another Kashmir House fellow here. Batch of 2008. Ashish was school captain in 2007, and he is now a practicing international disputes lawyer in Paris. So Ashish, thank you very much for joining the conversation today and for moderating this conversation with Kanti Bajpai. Over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on. And thanks, Kanti, for agreeing to doing this. It's always a bit daunting to be moderating a chat with your ex-headmaster. But I've just finished reading the book. I really enjoyed it. And I think just a sense of my views on the book sort of seeks to explain why we are where we are in the Indo-China relationship. And it does so through the prism of what Kanti calls these 4 Ps: perception, perimeters or borders, partnerships, and power. And Kanti, I was wondering if you could just introduce the book by talking about these 4 Ps. And then perhaps also just talk a little bit about the way you've structured the book. There's a lot of scholarship here, but what I really enjoyed about the book was also a lot of personal anecdotes. Kanti is someone who clearly has engaged with China for many, many years. And he's brought the full weight of this experience to bear when writing this book. And I think it's a much richer book for it. So Kanti, if you could talk about those 2 things, the sort of the broad, intellectual framework of the book, but also your personal relationship with China and the way you've brought that to bear in this book.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ashish. And thank you very much, Tarun, for the nice introduction and for setting this up. Thanks to everyone at DSOBS. It's great to be back in a Doon School setting of a kind, which is the alumni. And of course, they're one of the heartbeats of the school, and that always bears saying. So it's terrific to do this. I also want to thank Yash Gandhi, who was our kind of media and really helped kind of kick me into doing this, in the sense that it was his thought, and then we worked out the details. But thanks, Yash, for also playing a role in putting this together. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and let me just kick it off by just saying something, as Ashish said, about the 4 Ps. And there are many different ways to cut the cake. There's so much going on between India and China. When I started out writing this for Juggernaut Books, I had a list of, 22 topics. And I realized that my mandate was to write a book of about 50,000 words. If you divide that by 20, you'd get these tiny little chapters of about 2,000 words each, which is 2 columns in a newspaper or a bit more. And that doesn't allow you to do justice to anything. Plus, at that point, all you get is a long list. And there's very little point writing a book for a general audience, because this is a general audience book. It's not the kind of very rigorous, dry academic tome. There's no point writing a book for a general audience that's just a list. They want a bit of an attitude or a point of view. And Juggernaut Books had to slap me around a little bit, because as an academic, that's not exactly the kind of book we're used to delivering. And that speaks a little bit to Ashish's other point, which is they kept saying, please do draw on your personal experiences and insights, even if those wouldn't be admissible in the court of academia. And so here and there, I've salt and peppered them into the book. And I think some of them are quite fun and others may not be quite that apposite, but anyway, that's my little bow to my publisher. Anyway, to the 4 Ps, I had to, from all these topics, the more I thought about it, it seemed to me these 4 Ps were kind of foundational. And so the first one is mutual perceptions. And I began there rather than maybe the perimeter, which most people might have expected, which is the border problem and Tibet. And I did it because it seemed to me that's one of the areas that we don't touch very often, primarily because it's a bit hard to get your hands on. It's a bit hard to touch and feel. It all seems very slippery, this issue of how the two perceive each other. But there is some data out there, and I tried to mine it as best I could to give us a feel for some deep underlying attitudes, at least in the modern period, but I take the story back to Buddhist times, about how the two looked at each other. And so this first chapter is subtitled From Respect to Disdain, how our perceptions moved from mutual respect historically, from China's initial reception of Buddhism, its adoption of it, the pilgrimages back and forth, particularly from China to India, but then the movement of monks and books and manuscripts and ideas from India back to China, and sometimes the reverse. So that was a period of respect, and very broadly, that takes us from, the movement of Buddhism into China to about 1000 of the Christian era. And then it moves from that period of mutual respect to what I call disdain. And somewhere else where I presented it, they said, oh, that's a rather strong word. And I suppose that might be true, but it's an evocative one, and it sort of captures a little bit of what I want to say. By the late 19th century, I think there's good evidence that, particularly in China, their view of India and Indians began to be rather disrespectful, partly out of their experience of Indian soldiers and traders and policemen operating in China under colonial rule, but partly as their intellectuals looked at India. They felt that India was, a rather chaotic country, a disunited country, an inefficient country that had, and, not to put too fine a word on it, perhaps, a kind of almost a cowardly country in having succumbed to colonial rule, having lived with colonial rule and not having overthrown it. And the point for them was, don't become like India. So I think from there, then of course, through the border problem and into more modern and even contemporary times, there's a good bit of evidence that China still looks at India as backward, as not quite independent in its thought, now tied to the United States rather than being a colony, and being even now what they call a Luan kind of country, a chaotic, disjointed, disorganized, undisciplined. So that's the first kind of, in a sense, driver of this lack of friendship. I mean, it bears saying that on the Indian side too, there's racism and disrespect towards the Chinese in various ways. And we can probably talk about that later, although we probably have a better sense of that as Indians than, so I probably don't need to say too much. The second P is perimeters. And here, I mean, this is fairly familiar ground, but the broad point in the chapter is that, interestingly, from 1949 to now, we go through 2 cycles of a movement from attempts at cooperation to outright conflict and war in the first cycle, climaxing in 1962. And in the second cycle, well, one could say climaxing in the events of last summer. And in between, there are varying degrees of cooperation. And I think sometimes, we forget that they were, I was going to say good-natured, but at least earnest attempts at cooperation on both sides. I think there's a tendency to think that we were the earnest ones, the Chinese were not. But my sense is that, notwithstanding Mao and Zhou Enlai's very cold-eyed look at relationships and international relations, they did genuinely for a while try also to come to an accommodation of the border with India. So also Tibet. I mentioned Tibet. It'll come back in questions, I hope, but I have been saying that when you think India-China conflict, please think Tibet behind it. Whenever the Chinese feel uneasy about Tibet, or particularly uneasy, then things begin to get hot with India. And I think we've gone through both cooperation, and conflict over Tibet in these two cycles. The good news may be that if the events of last summer were the peak of the second cycle from cooperation to conflict, we might be exiting or transitioning into a third cycle. I hope we break the cycle of cooperation, and this time perhaps we'll get it all right and come to some fundamental resolutions. But anyway, that's the, and I can go into why, we didn't get a border settlement and so on. They bear on various other issues, but let me just stop there on that. The third is strategic partnerships. This I'll do real quick. Basically, again, I see two cycles here of a movement where India and China briefly were kind of in a diplomatic entente. That is, they were quite close to each other, not really working partners, but convergent in their distrust of the United States that was the hegemon, both in the first Cold War, and I would say now again, since about the year 1989, for about half a decade or a decade again, they were in a kind of loose entente against American primacy. But other than that, they've always been rivalrous. India was at times with the Soviet Union for a very long time during the Cold War, and briefly with the United States at the time when we fought the Chinese in 1962, 1963. And the Chinese were first allies of the Soviet Union and then of the United States. But we were never, India and China, on the same side against either the Soviet Union or the United States. We were never strategic partners or outright allies. And there's a slight difference between those two things for political scientists. And so I think this means something. It means that, we've not got a history, a modern history, and even perhaps a much older history of two governments, leaderships, civilian and military, being close to each other, learning from each other, learning to trust each other, knowing each other's kind of standard operating procedures, knowing each other's strategic cultures well enough. And that means that it's very difficult for them to quite understand what the other is up to and thinking at crucial moments. And the last P is power, or comprehensive national power. And here I unpack, fairly traditional three elements of comprehensive national power, which is economic power, military power, and so-called soft power. I think the economic power story is very well known. China is 5 times India's size in GDP terms. But perhaps the more interesting points in the chapter are in military power and soft power. So I make the argument that even though China, in a lot of weapon systems, has the numbers on India, is superior in terms of tanks, in terms of artillery pieces, in terms of combat aircraft, for instance. In the maritime domain, in terms of submarines, in terms of in terms of other combat boats, and likely soon to overtake us in terms of the aircraft carriers as well. Nonetheless, as far as both domains go, the land borders as well as the maritime domain, in fact, China's superiority will find it difficult, as it has in the past, to translate into outright kind of military, well, let's say military superiority. And all I mean by that is that the Chinese can't quite ever deal us a knockout blow in either case. And two things at least save us, more, but at least two things. The first is geography. It's very hard to fight up there at 14,000 feet, freezing to the point where the cold causes, your lungs to kind of freeze or bubble up, and you choke on your own, on your own lung water. Supplies, the ability to move, the ability, in essence, to sustain a long conflict is very, very difficult in those heights. And the number of mountain passes that allow you to kind of infile or ingress are relatively limited across this big border. Likewise, in the maritime domain, it's a long way from China to the Indian Ocean, and from Hainan and other ports all the way into the Indian Ocean to bother India. And in fact, to use military parlance, India has the interior lines. That is to say, from its peninsular ports, the distance it has to go to supplies and to home bases is much shorter than China, which has the so-called exterior lines. China will probably have bases in the Indian Ocean, but those bases are very vulnerable, it seems to me, to Indian air power and naval power. So again, and of course, there are the choke points. So the Chinese Navy has to get through the Malacca and other straits, and the Indian Navy, at least for a while, to some extent, can bottle those up. So again, I mean, the military power is a bit deceptive if you just look at the bean counting, looking at the numbers crudely. Strategy, morale of troops, tactics, and so on and so forth count, and of course, geography helps us. And the last power is soft power, and this I think has exercised quite a lot of, controversy almost, but argumentation, which is wonderful, where I argue that, we in India probably think that we have the soft power superiority over the Chinese, but my own sense, looking at the slippery concept, trying to amass some data that's out there in terms of surveys and, bean counting of various kinds of soft power resources, shows that in fact, China probably outpaces us there and may do so increasingly so. Some of the areas where we were superior, such as, for instance, our open political system and democracy and so on. I mean, to the extent that we're going through a bit of a crisis, and to the extent that there's a bit of a yearning in India for a more authoritarian form of government, in fact, we might be handing that last soft power advantage we had to the Chinese, which is if we imitate their kind of stronger government or centralizing government, then in effect, the Chinese have won the argument. But nonetheless, I mean, I think the chapter basically tries to show, and its subtitle, From Parity to Asymmetry. So very crudely in the 1960s, probably on all three counts, except to some extent in military terms, there was parity. Today, sadly for India, that's no longer so, and the gap is likely to increase. Now, last word on this, which is that, why these four? I mean, it's always, well, take an example from personal life to give you a sense of why I chose these. I mean, I think if we look at others in our daily lives, our perceptions of each other count for a lot. How we see each other, are we respectful towards each other, or do we see each other, do we look down our noses at each other? I think that's a very important kind of factor, and some of it is very tacit, but still very palpable to the other side. So I think, mutual perceptions, whether it's about individuals or society to society, they matter. The other, of course, is, I mean, in our individual lives, we're very jealous of our own property, our homes and things that belong to us. I mean, the analogy to that is of course, our territory as a nation. So I think we will fight to protect our home and hearth and everything in it. And so I think very clearly for any human being, however humble their home and their possessions, that's something that you will fight to protect. Partnerships, I mean, of course, our friendships matter to us a great deal. And who our friends' or our enemies' friends or our rivals' friends are, or our rivals' enemies are, a lot depends on those kinds of networks. If we're friends with the same people, then perhaps we'll look at each other with a kindlier eye. This is in our personal relationships. Likewise, I think countries, if their view of each other is mediated through a country that is friendly to both, then they may serve as mediators, and we may rethink some aspects of our suspicion of each other. And lastly, of course, between individuals, there's always a power dynamic, from muscular power, which is our hard power, that is our military power by analogy, our economic power between us. Some of us are richer, some of us are not so well off, and that seems to count in how we dispose towards each other. And lastly, of course, there's soft power, which is, how much do you admire me? Soft power is the power of attraction and admiration towards someone, which they can use then to persuade you to do something for them that you otherwise wouldn't do. And it seems to me that obviously, if I admire you, look up to you, then I might be prone to do things for you without your having to exert hard power against me. And so your values and your intellect and so on. And likewise, I mean, I think between nations, soft power counts. If we admire another society's values, its political system, its intellectual prowess, its ethical values and conduct, then perhaps we'll do things for another country that otherwise we wouldn't be disposed to do. So let me just stop there. I think the last point I would make, I suppose, is what social scientists call overdetermination. Somebody might say, well, any one of these would explain why they're not friends, and that's true. I wish the book was rigorous enough to say which is the most important of these, but it doesn't. It gets a bit lazy. So I just throw it out And absolutely last point, the book was written in 3 months. It's intended to be a provocation. It's not the last word. Certainly it's not the first word. There's so much on India, China, and there are going to be a raft of wonderful books coming out in the next few months. But it's intended to provoke, I hope, in a responsible way. And so let me just stop there.
Thanks a lot, Kanti, for that introduction. Like Tarun said, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So please do send in your questions on the chat function or in the Q&A box. We've already got some questions coming in, Kanti, but I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator and ask you some questions to begin with of my own. I really enjoyed the book, like I mentioned. And I came away with questions from each of your chapters, I think relating to each of the 4 Ps. And I don't think we have time to go through all of them, though I'll keep some of them in reserve. But perhaps if I could just begin with perceptions. It was really interesting to me reading that chapter, just how little the 2 countries know about each other. Both, at a people-to-people level, but even, in some cases, extending up the ranks of officialdom. Just 3 days ago, Vijay Gokhale, who's former Indian ambassador to China and former foreign secretary, wrote a piece in the Indian Express called "India's Superficial Understanding of China Will No Longer Do." And in that piece, his thesis was Indians can no longer afford to have a superficial understanding of their largest neighbor and would-be hegemon. Now, why do you think, despite sharing such a long boundary, such a long history, having fought a war, why do you think we have this understanding, this superficial understanding of each other? Is it, a legacy, a colonial legacy in both countries of colonial ways of looking at each other? Or is it something that's a result of, more recent relationships? Yeah, I mean, I don't know what your take on that would be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that, for years, academics who deal in this area have been asking. And I think one of the answers is that it's not restricted to China. I mean, the amount of knowledge we have of neighboring Pakistan, with whom we fought, 4 wars. I mean, really, if I was to convene a table at the India International Center in Delhi and bring all the really deep Pakistan watchers we have in India, let's leave out the Indian diplomats who served there and whose bread and butter it is, of course, professionally. I doubt we could amass more than about 20 people who've written 20 books on Pakistan. And arguably, that's our most important relationship up to this point. Perhaps wrongly, maybe China always was, but in the eyes of many, it was Pakistan. On China, we actually have a better story to tell that way. We have an Institute of Chinese Studies. We have no equivalent for Pakistan, as far as I know. We have language programs in Chinese. We have centers in JNU and Delhi University and select other universities, including a new one at Ashoka University. So we're doing a little bit better there. But even so, I would say that, if you put together for a country of 1.3 billion people, thinking about a rival country of 1.4 billion people, I mean, it is almost laughable the amount of expertise that we have in India. China is somewhat better off in terms of their expertise about us. So this is not to say why it's the case. I mean, I'm just restating what you've said, actually. But I think the problem is that, we still, in this area of foreign policy, we have a very weak civil society. In other areas of social policy, economic policy in India, internal politics, and all of that, we have enormous capacity and a civil society that's engaged and can't be, restrained beyond a point. We have think tanks and institutes and universities and talking heads like me and newspaper commentary and all of that. But as soon as you get to foreign policy, it's kind of walled off, and civil society hasn't, burst in and broken down that wall. It's partly the government's fault. I mean, the government has asserted the right to draw a veil of silence and secrecy about foreign policy. And because it's about so-called high politics vis-a-vis another country, it doesn't want, civil society, that is ordinary Indians, trespassing in that area. And so I think that's probably it, that we just have not managed, on either side, on the government side or civil society, to break through that wall and to let loose intellectual energies, and then attract money from the Tarunsanis, the business folks, to support us in think tanks and so on, to really develop an enormous amount of expertise. I mean, on a more cultural level, I suppose I'll just stop there, and this maybe relates to your colonial point. I mean, when Indians look out and think about where they want to go, where they want to travel, what they want to talk about when they want to boast a little bit about their foreign travels and so on and so forth, I don't think it's China. I don't think it's Asia that really, although it's beginning to change, we still look westwards. That's where we want to live, work, travel in, and their popular culture and so on is what comes to mind immediately. And so I think China really suffers from that. I mean, it's the same in China. Chinese students and so on that I have in my classes, if they've come here to Singapore, but I mean, India is not high on their list of places to go in their spare time. It would be the West or at best some neighbors in East Asia. And I think that accounts for a lot. So I think there's the civil society government problem in India, and then there's the kind of colonial leftover at a cultural level.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, I had a bunch of other questions, but the Q&A box is blowing up, and old boys aren't shy. So what I'm going to do is we have an option of getting the Secretariat to call on individuals, and to have you on camera asking your question yourself. If you're uncomfortable with that, just let me know, and I can just read out the question you've asked. But if we could first go to Uday Pratap Singh, who has a question for Kanti. And if Neha could put him on screen, Uday, if you're okay with that.
Maybe he isn't.
maybe he isn't.
No, wait, is he able to get in? Neha, are you able to reach him? No, I think is Neha been able to do that?
If it's a problem, I can just ask the question.
No,
I've got it
give
here.
me a minute.
Neha,
are you there, Neha?
If it's there from our time, then he should be comfortable given his TV.
Yeah, exactly. Given his TV expertise.
He is. I don't know. I think there's a. Is it okay? I think there must be.
Come back to his question when he gets on or whatever.
Yes.
Well, let me. Okay.
You do
what I'll do is, until I get an indication from Neha that she's all right putting people on screen, I'm just going to read out his question for you, Kanti, so we can move quicker. Yeah. Uday asks, why is disengagement at Galwan taking so long despite being committed to by the Chinese? Do you believe talks at local commander level can yield a breakthrough, or will an intervention be needed at a government or diplomatic level? And I guess, I'll just supplement that with a question of mine, which is, you talk about how there's been an uptick of confrontation at the border, over the last maybe 10 years, or perhaps a little less, 5 years. Why has that been the case? And how much is connected to, what may be a fifth P, which is personalities, and Xi Jinping's rise in China, and, the assertion of a more muscular foreign policy in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, what's happening in Galwan and the talks and so on, I mean, obviously it's all shielded from us and it's very difficult to know, but I think it's a fair bet that, beyond the point, the local commanders do have to play a role. I mean, these are very obscure, difficult to know places, and some joint secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs has never been there. And even if he has, he won't know every nook and cranny and the military science of dealing with all those kinds of issues. Nor will, the civil servant in the MOD. So some part of this just has to be done by the local commanders. And by local, I don't mean literally the guy sitting on the mountain peak, but the command structures in the sub-region behind, who know the maps, know the elevations, know the what's kind of going on. And even they would be surprised about some of the things that have happened and could happen. So I think it certainly has to be, at the end of the day, does have to involve them. But since disengagement is a symbolic act as well, it's not just a purely military act up there. Clearly, someone has to sanction it back home at the civilian political level, because you don't want to, neither side wants to appear as if they're giving up, as if they've appeased and stood down. So, it has to be sanctioned by higher authorities, civilian, political, back in Delhi and Beijing. So I think it'll need both tracks. And of course, it is difficult. And there are institutional kinds of interests that come into play. Surely local commanders and the PLA might have some kinds of elements of resistance to, giving up too quickly areas that they've got hold of. Likewise, the Indian Army, even when their civilians might be telling them something else. Now, this is probably less so in the PLA because they have the commissars right there from the party. So, the political military is much more tightly integrated. But surely, yeah, it'll take both tracks. And why is it taking so long? I think that relates to the second part of the question, which is, we've had a growing incursions since about 2006. In the hundreds, in the scores every year. From a period before that when the numbers were perhaps in the tens. And then you get from 2013 onwards a significant confrontation every year. 2013, Depsang Plain, 2014, Chumar, even as Xi Jinping and Modi were sitting on a jhula in Ahmedabad. 2015 in Birdsea, which is one of those that has been kind of somewhat conveniently forgotten by the Indian media. And then, of course, 2017 in Doklam. Now, 3 of them happened in the Ladakh sector. And again, I mean, we're too close to the events to really know, but it does seem to me that in all these cases, as I said, think Tibet. When the Chinese get nervy about Tibet, then they're prone to, especially at a time when they think they're rampant and strong, they're prone to take actions. And I think the road that we built and have been, and the other infrastructure we've been refurbishing and building in this sector for the last 10 years or so, going back to at least Manmohan Singh's time, has certainly annoyed them, worried them. And the DBO road that snakes up towards the Karakoram Pass was probably the last straw for them. And I mean, of course, incidental issues, quote unquote, overturning Article 370, perhaps some statements made in Parliament that were fairly aggressive on our ownership of Aksai Chin and so on, might have been a red rag to, as it were, to the Chinese. So it might account for what happened. But they're not going to pull away from there all that easily. And just on Tibet, I mean, we're entering a phase with the Dalai Lama when he's aging. I hope he lives a good long life ahead of him, but we're already in the beginnings of a transition. And Chinese antenna and worries will be significant. And so it does seem to me that issues surrounding the border, because Tibet is the border, it's the land behind the border, and it's 18% of China's landmass. They are extremely sensitive, even though we don't quite get it, I think. And so, we're going to have some tense days ahead, potentially. The next theater might be the East. We can talk about that later if it comes to it.
All right. The next question.
I just want to say one thing. Uday said that he's not camera shy, so his specialist told me to tell you that. So there's some technical glitch, but he's not camera shy, and he's very grateful that you've answered the question.
Yeah, I think of that, there's no doubt, given that he's on TV every day. But next question is from Mr. Sumanjit Chaudhary, and we see that he is up on screen. Yeah, so Mr. Chaudhary, if you can go on.
Sure. Hi, Kanti. Well, I have a question for Kanti. And, as China gets richer and richer, and its citizens get more educated, and they travel abroad so much, and they receive so many inputs from outside, don't you find it surprising that there hasn't been any real pushback against the party and against the communist way of life, which has imposed so many restrictions on the Chinese people? I mean, is there stuff happening subterraneously? Because in these things, you often don't see anything, and then suddenly, bang, something happens, and everyone says, oh, well, it had to happen. Yeah. But I find this very, very strange, and I often ponder about it. What's your view on this?
Yeah, so the final chapter in the book, I'm glad you asked, because in all the sessions I've been doing, I never quite got to the conclusion of the book, which is looking ahead. In a way, that's where I deal with that issue. Again, my publisher slapped me around a bit and said, please project Chinese power and way of life and so on, tell us something more about that. And I said, I'm not quite that kind of a China expert, but here goes anyway. And what I found was something along the lines that you are pointing to. quite astutely, which is that, in fact, if you look at some of the figures, there have been, over the last 15 to 20 years, a growing number of domestic protests. I mean, they're running to, some estimates go from 70,000 to hundreds of thousands a year. And so, you know, we don't hear about them enough, but people who watch China closely have noted it. And then they've looked at, well, what are these protests about? It turns out that a lot of them happen around Chinese New Year. So it happens a lot related to employment. Their money is not given to them on time. They're going home. They want to take home presents and buy their tickets home and come back looking swank, but their employers are not coughing up money. So a lot of disputes around that. There are other labor, some labor-related disputes. There are disputes over land, ownership of land and tenancy and rent, and, you know, and houses and apartments that are built that are not great and things like that. And then there are some more political protests, but they tend to be not very many in number. And here and there might be a protest relating to, you know, kind of some worries about environmental issues, the kind of social protest stuff that is more postmodern almost, you know. But what the writings seem to suggest is that there's kind of a splitting in Chinese opinion. So particularly younger Chinese who are, as you say, more exposed to kind of these more liberal winds of change, they split their opinion. And some of that we can see in India as well, by the way, which is they blame the local, provincial or city government for all these local ills. And when their protests are stopped and they're beaten over the head or whatever, they continue to blame the local handling of it. And Beijing, masterfully and shrewdly, also points its finger at the local officials and provincial types, saying, oh, you've mishandled it completely, and please do something to take care of local grievances. And one of the writers I quote who thought about this said, you know, there's kind of a liberal nationalism in China amongst young people, which is they are liberal increasingly about some of these causes and they like to express their unhappiness, but they're supremely nationalistic also. And that leads them not to blame the central government and Xi Jinping beyond a point, because Xi Jinping and the central government is the outward facing, you know, aspect of China to the rest of the world. And so their nationalism prevents them from, you know, kind of expressing resentment towards the central government too much. So I think some of what exists is this. Yes, with growing prosperity, education, and so on, they have become more liberal, but their resentment and protests are directed at local authorities, not the central government. So you don't have a systemic challenge to the Communist Party and its rule. So that's one answer. I mean, I think to me, it's fairly satisfying. And it kind of, you know, bridges this kind of sense that we have that surely it must happen in China as everywhere else, that people, as they get more empowered, do express themselves, but then it doesn't blow up at the same time. And then I try out 4 ideas about when it could blow up systemically, but maybe we leave that for later so that we can get to some other questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Abhijit. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Kanti. Next question is from Mr. Vivek Bammi.
Hey, Maira. So
Mr. Bammi, you're on mute.
You're on
mute.
How are you doing, Kanti?
Wow, it's been a while. So
it's great to see you. And first of all, before I ask my question, I'd like to thank DSOBS, the Secretariat, all of you for inviting an educator. I think too often we forget that how important a role educators like Kanti play in the world. Of course, having been HM of DOSCO as well. But I just think it's a very good thing that we have educators on our panel from time to time. And of course, I'm being a bit sneaky because I've also been an educator. I taught in Doon for 2 sessions, and I've been an international educator all my life. So I have a question for you, Kanti, and I really liked your answer to the previous question. But I see that, and I have taught in Beijing for 2 years, and I loved, I must say I loved modern China, although I don't like the government particularly. But I think the citizens there and my colleagues, they were just first-rate people, you know. So I have great admiration for what China has done in the last 40 or 50 years, as well as, of course, the great cultural links, which you point to in your first P, perceptions. but that's where I really want to focus on. We see that in places like Singapore, where you are located now, that overseas Chinese and overseas Indians cooperate really well. You know, Singapore is a thriving, wonderful success story. I happened to be in Indonesia for 25 years. So to me, Singapore was always a wonderful story. And similarly with modern China, since Deng Xiaoping has been an incredible success story. So if we go back to the idea of perceptions, I'd like to sort of say that why can't Indians be a little more humble, recognizing the success of both these societies? One is a small society like Singapore, but still an incredible story. And the other is, of course, a large country like China. What could Indians like ourselves, not just overseas, but Indians living in India, what could we learn from them? What could we learn from the overseas Chinese? What could we learn from the Chinese so that our perceptions improve, or at least give us some clue of how we could move ahead with this relationship?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I over the years, I've been following your career, so I know you've had great experience in the region, and that makes me a bit nervous in answering this, to be honest.
You'll be more an expert than me anyway.
Let me just say a few thoughts, though. I mean, I think obviously I've been in Singapore a decade or so, and it is a multicultural society that really works well, and it's a majority Chinese society, 70%. Chinese, mostly, I mean, Chinese who were born and raised here, although there is a significant number coming in from other Chinese societies, Taiwan, the mainland, Hong Kong, elsewhere, Malaysia. But I think it's the foundational principles going back to 1965 in Singapore at the hands of Lee Kuan Yew, where he looked around at the other government models in Southeast Asia and decided Singapore was going to be, you know, a multiracial, multicultural society, where despite the Chinese majority, they were going to insist that everyone was equal before the law, et cetera, and in governance. And that, you know, the vehicle was meritocracy. If you were clever and you attained certain kinds of standards and competences, then you would be in positions of power. And I mean, not to say that, you know, everything is hunky-dory, and Singapore knows that that's not the case. We haven't had a non-Chinese prime minister here, for instance, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen soon. But for all that, Indians, Malays do rise to the top. I mean, I was vice dean research in my institution. There are many Indians in the university at the top ranks. So Singapore has, you know, worked out a system. And of course, they're very strong about enforcing rights, non-discrimination, and any kind of racial prejudices is punished very severely. I think China, in mainland China, I mean, coming back a little bit to the question that Sumanjit posed, I mean, looking at China, there is a liberal streak, certainly, and a set of liberal values, multicultural values in Chinese people. You know, in the book, for instance, Ashish was talking about some of these personal stories. I mined fellow DOSCO's book, Vikram Seth's book, you know, when he travels back from China, you know, to India back in the 80s. And he finds a very kindly, curiosity-filled sort of a set of encounters with ordinary Chinese in the trains, in buses, in cafes. And I think there's really quite a lot of that. There's a lot of attraction, quite a lot of attraction to Bollywood and so on. Of course, there's ignorance as well. And like I was saying earlier, a lot of excitement about other countries in East Asia or looking west. And I think, you know, India hasn't done its homework. We want to project our cultural sort of goods and values elsewhere, but we haven't done it enough in China, it seems to me. It may be a difficult market to crack, just as our businessmen know it's a difficult market to crack for their goods and services. The language does get in the way. But, you know, prosperous, young, urban Chinese are increasingly looking for all kinds of experiences. And I have them in my classroom, and I know how engaging they can be. And so I think there's a base there. And I think the Indian embassy, our cultural stormtroopers, as it were, our artists and so on, have to look more to places like China to reach out there. So I think bridges can be built. It won't happen immediately. And there is a certain amount of arrogance on both sides and racism on both sides that gets in the way. But thanks for that. I mean, I think there's more, you know, kind of liberalism at that level in China and towards other cultures. And, I mean, they do deep down also in China, I think you probably had this experience more than me, have a sense of India, of cultural influences from India, much more than we acknowledge from China, I think. And Mao said something like, there's an old Chinese saying something about, well, if you were born in a second life, you would have always wanted to be born in India, and as an Indian. So that's their kind of compliment. I don't know if we have an equivalent to that in India. I don't think we do for the Chinese.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, but I think your point about modern liberal values is a very good one. And that's probably one which can bring young Indians and young Chinese together. And of course, I think that's the best avenue to reducing conflict, is when we have people-to-people contact and they get to know each other on a personal level.
I mean, just take one point that does come up in the book to underline the point, and then I guess we'll move on, which is look at tourism. I mean, the numbers of Indian tourists who go to China, I think, are greater than the Chinese that come to India by factors of 4, 5, 7, 10. One of the reasons for that is very material and nothing to do with culture. It's just that our tourist facilities are so horrible that the Chinese won't come.
Thanks, Kanti.
Yeah, great to see you.
Great to see you too.
Email you. I'll email.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Now we'll move to Mr. Jayantlal.
Hey, hi guys, how are you?
Good.
Kanti, good to see you again. Kanti, my question to you is very simple. We have a Tibetan government in exile. We have a prime minister in waiting. I've met him, by the way, in Sikkim, and he does move around like a head of state. What happens when the Dalai Lama is no more, and what will happen to this government in exile? And what happens to all these Tibetans who are really also helping us on the border at this point in time?
Yeah, well, this is what I said, when you think troubles with China, think Tibet, and I think we never quite get the degree of sensitivity they have. We look at them, this huge, a 90, 100-pound bear that is China, and we think, why are they so sensitive about Tibet? But they are. There are cultural roots of that. There are historical roots for that. There are military strategic roots of that. And then there is this presence of Tibetans in India. And there's the diaspora here, there's the Dalai, and there's this so-called government in exile, which of course, India has never given it that nomenclature, but in effect, that's what it is. And so this is going to be a very tricky time. And no one's quite sure. There were talks with the Dalai Lama in Beijing back in the 90s. It seemed to be going quite well. And then the Dalai, the Chinese say, made certain kinds of demands or statements that put them in a difficult spot, which was, he said, no, not only am I talking, when I'm talking Tibet, I'm not just talking about TAR, Tibet Autonomous Region, which is the Tibet that we think about today, but the much larger Tibetan areas in the neighboring provinces of China. So, I mean, if you take all those areas into account, you might be looking at, 25, 30% of the landmass of China. And he was saying, Tibet, TAR should have some authority in those areas also, with the Tibetans who live there. And Beijing, of course, couldn't accept that. So, and then this Tibetan government in exile, so-called, has come about. So it's, in a sense, it's complicated life for Beijing. And so their sensitivity has grown. And I warrant it's also increased the complications for us in India. When the next Dalai is about to be appointed, I mean, what role would this government play in exile play? What role should Delhi play? If it's someone chosen from within the Tibetan community in exile in India or outside of China, what role will Delhi play? Will it recognize that person or not? The pressures will be enormous regardless. If the Chinese, as they will, insist on choosing the next Dalai, they will certainly force on us a decision. You better recognize this person. Will we? I fear we're entering a period of great difficulties and challenges ahead on the matter related to Tibet. And this prime minister, so-called, of the Tibetan government in exile, he's going to have to play a very careful and fine hand And he could find himself caught between Delhi, between his own community here, between a Karmapa Lama, between someone nominated by Beijing, and of course a worldwide diaspora. And there may be many different views on who should be and how the next Dalai should be chosen. So thanks for that question. It allows me to dramatize a point that's come home to me more since I wrote the book in sessions like this, that the Tibetan factor is going to be probably more important and will demand a lot of shrewdness and good hands at the wheel in Delhi when the transition really happens.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you both. Mr. Mayank Kumar.
Hi, Kanti.
Hi, Mayank.
One observation and then two questions, quick ones. One is, on the issue of modern youngsters being content with, I think there's a huge amount of national pride amongst the Chinese and the youngsters in terms of where their country is placed amongst the world, across the global diaspora. And that, I think, is one of the factors that holds and enables the party in power to remain very strongly having its control. Two questions. I've been traveling to China since 2004 on work, and I've spent roughly 4 weeks a year traveling across various cities, interacting with a number of engineering consulting companies there, large, small, all types. And till 2008, I found them very self-effacing, very amenable to discussions, etc. Post the Beijing Olympics, I found that there was a huge amount of swagger and arrogance in theirs, and it just became that we know best. Is this something that kind of gels with your observations?
Yeah.
Or am I just being too sensitive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean,
that's the first question.
All right. Do you want me to answer that first and then you do the second?
Perhaps
whichever way you want.
Mr. Kumar, if you could ask your second question first, and then
okay, the second question is that I also noticed that a lot of youngsters especially were are seeking spiritual connects. And therefore, is there a role for India to play a covert, soft power game or strategy in China?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, interesting questions. I think a lot of people who watch China would say 2008, for a variety of reasons, was a bit of a cutoff point in the direction that you note, which is a growing self-confidence, perhaps overconfidence, amounting to arrogance and dismissiveness towards others, except perhaps the United States, and even there to some extent. And why 2008? I mean, that was the year of the financial crisis. And so it picked up steam from that. I think also, one might say at 08, 09, 010, the Chinese economy reached a kind of tipping point in terms of closing the gap with the United States in nominal terms, if not PPP terms, of course. Thirdly, I think, by 2012, Xi Jinping has come to power. And so he's been far more out there in terms of, the China dream. And the China dream he's been pretty unabashed about, which means, the dream to be number one. And if you heard him again just the other day, he pulls no punches about his ambition for China to be the number one country. I mean, there are no ifs or buts there. And when he says ifs number one, he does, caveat it by saying that doesn't mean we want to dethrone the Americans and so on. But I think we can take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. He would love to, at different levels and different dimensions, dethrone the Americans without causing a problem geopolitically. But so I think, you're right, about 08, 09, 010, you can see this kind of sharpening of China's, chest puffing out and so on. And that's had an attitude towards India as well. I mean, it's around that time that we get also in India China beginning to be far more assertive on the border and its claims on Arunachal. I mean, it's always had a claim on Arunachal, but by 06, 07, 08, it was very publicly wagging its finger over its claims to all of Arunachal Pradesh. It led to a problem with Delhi. We stopped then being so fulsome about our recognition of Tibet as being part of China. In all the joint statements after 2010, we've dropped the statement we used to routinely make about Tibet. So I think there's no doubt that, you know, a sense of their place in the world, their successes, their achievements, their power, their coming of age in the reckoning and standing in the world, right about that time that you point to. I mean, and I, in the book, I mean, I note even earlier, actually, I mean, vis-a-vis India, at least, their kind of, you know, almost kind of good-natured dismissal of India. I mean, I have a story, you know, about in 1998, going from JNU for a conference in China, where a young Indian woman at this big conference said, oh, you know, India will pass China in population terms, which we know will happen very soon in the next, in fact, 5 or 10 years. And a young Chinese woman, very good-natured. I mean, she was delightful socially later. She pressed her button immediately and said, that's impossible. China can never be behind India in anything, you know. And then a few minutes later, talk turned to nuclear weapons, and somebody was comparing the Chinese nuclear weapons program with Britain and France and the second-tier nuclear weapons programs, including India, where we're all in the 200, 300 nuclear weapons zone. And a very nice Chinese professor, elderly man sitting next to me, spoke up and he said, no, that's impossible. Yes, I mean, France and Britain we recognize, but India, India's nowhere in nuclear terms. I mean, and I showed him the numbers. I mean, at that point, the numbers were quite iffy, but he just left scratching his head. He couldn't believe it. So there is that. I mean, you know, that part of, there's the liberal China of young people, coming to your other question, who are curious spiritually and all of that. There's the flourishing of yoga and some interest in India. I'm not sure that, you know, the spiritual way to Chinese hearts is quite the way. I mean, when Buddhism came to China, they were very clear that, you know, they Sinicized it, made it their own. And much of the Buddhism we see in East Asia and in parts of Southeast Asia went from China. It also went from India, it went from Sri Lanka. But because Buddhism more or less died in India by about, 1000 of the Christian era, you know, the Buddhist impact of India now in China, I would say, is very, very low. And Hinduism, I think, I don't know. I mean, there are some Hindu remnants there, but I don't think there's much of a card to play there.
No, I'm talking more of Buddhism.
Yeah, I don't think we can play the Buddhist card much there, my sense is. I mean, it's just at the level of, it's a good thing to do historically so that the two societies can get to know each other better. But I don't think it would mobilize a lot of people and soften their view of India much. But
Thanks for that answer, Kanti. I'm just going to take a pause for a second here to say that we've gone through about an hour. We still have a lot of questions though. So I don't know how long, Kanti, you're willing to stay on.
I can stay on, but you can't stop a professor talking, you know.
Yeah. But what I will do now is turn to Chetan Agarwal, who's next. I think he's misspelled his name, but that is Chetan. And if everyone can keep their questions short going forward, so that we can just get to as many people as possible.
And I'll try to be short as well.
Thank you, Ashish. Great to be here. Thank you, sir, for the lovely insights. It reminds of a school discussion where you would often remark that we always start a question by saying or asking, don't you think, sir? So I'll also use that phrase in my question. Probably one of the most important components of any relationship, and China is perhaps India's largest trade partner, certainly so if we add Hong Kong's figures to China's. So, do you think that India took the right decision to not join the RCEP? And don't you think that it was a correct decision because of China's opaque practices in terms of trade and unwillingness to be transparent about its behavior?
Yeah, I mean, the book doesn't deal with it because I'm not an economist, and I think that ground is quite well trod. But it's an important question, obviously. And I'm not sure I have any blindingly original thoughts, but just to make 2 or 3 points. I mean, I think the latest trade figures show that trade is still booming, despite the events of last year. So we're kind of locked in on all kinds of things that we need from China. And there's no easy way out of that without disrupting our own economy and hurting ourselves. And I think the Chinese know it. So they were never terribly, terribly worried when the fracas happened and there was talk in India about, kind of even stopping the flow of goods amongst the common area. On the RCEP, I mean, my own sense is that it was a mistake to not go through with it. The story will be told at some point. I mean, of course, everyone in the world knows that the Chinese do all kinds of stuff in relation to trade. There are subsidies, there are invisible subsidies, there are non-trade barriers, there's intellectual property theft, there's, on and on. So that's the case. But as a result of this, what it really looks like in this region, Southeast Asia, and even to the Chinese, is that India has, for the Chinese, very conveniently, in a sense, left another strategic space open to them. I mean, it's an economic space, but economics also is a strategic matter. And so we've kind of vacated a strategic space to them. Now we say in defense that, oh, well, we'll have all these bilateral deals with all these Southeast Asian countries, all the other RCEP countries. So actually it'll all be okay. But, Jagdish Bhagwati told us a long time ago, the economist, that then you get into the spaghetti bowl problem. There'll be so many agreements and standards and so on, all higgledy-piggledy intertwining, that God save the poor trader who's trying to export and deal with all these regulations. So you spoil a perfect trading regime if you have if you have high transaction costs like that. It adds to your costs and makes you uncompetitive and so on. So it seems to me that we should have taken the hit domestically from certain sectors that were very worried about China. I mean, in any case, bilateral trade with China is booming. How much more could how much worse could it have got? So I would have said not to leave that space open to the Chinese and disappoint our partners here in this region and achieve what, really? I mean, not very much. And the wider reputation we've got is that, we don't have the courage to take certain very tough decisions and ride them out, unlike what the Chinese did at certain points. And that we are a country that specializes in saying no, and we walk away from agreements, whether it's Doha, whether it's RCEP, whether it's, several others. So there's a sort of feeling that it's an India that can't say yes. And that's maybe not the best place to be. So, I mean, long and short, I mean, I would put my money on, it was probably a mistake. My hope is that at some point when things ease up and the government, relooks it, that we will find a way to come back into RCEP, that the other partners will make some concession of some kind, and it'll allow us to declare a minor victory, and then we can go back in.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Next question from Mr. Harshvardhan. Mr. Harshvardhan, you're on mute. If you ask,
yeah, I just realized that. Yeah, sorry, I'm not on video. I'm still in my sort of night suit. I'm out far west. So my question, I'd sort of put it in. I've been reading old documents from the National Archives of India, and I can see from that the British treated China very poorly, especially with respect to Tibet and what is now called Xinjiang. And I was wondering whether right after independence, we sort of missed an opportunity to patch things up with China. But I do realize that it's unfortunately coincided with turmoil in China itself. So, we can't turn the clock back, but I was really surprised how poorly the British treated Tibet and Xinjiang.
Well, thanks for that, Harshvardhan. I mean, in a way, you shouldn't be. I mean, the Brits had their own ruthlessness and double-facedness in dealing with people, as we know in India, I guess. I think the paper trail there is not a very edifying one in terms of the way the British dealt with things. I mean, there were times when they were quite careful and they contradicted themselves. particularly on the western sector, on Ladakh, Aksai Chin, that area. And so it's a mixed record, but if you roll the movie forward to, as you did, to when we take the reins over ourselves, and then 2 years later, Mao and the Communist Party ride to power in Beijing. I show in the perimeters chapter, drawing on other people's work. So unlike you, I haven't really been to the archives, but these folks have, and I gratefully acknowledge their work. But what that shows is that between 49 and 54, at least, both sides were hesitant to table the issue. They certainly on the Indian side, you have two schools of thought. One was what I call the sooner school. So deal with the Chinese sooner rather than later on the issue of Tibet and the border. So my grandfather, Kanti Bajpai, who was Secretary General of the Ministry of External Affairs under Nehru, the first one, he was part of that sooner school. Shiv Shankar Menon's grandfather, KPS Menon, was with Bajpai in the sooner school. And then on the other side, you have Panikkar, ambassador in Beijing, who was part of the later school. He was like, don't raise the issue with the Chinese about borders and Tibet and all of that. They haven't said anything. Let sleeping dogs lie until they don't. And then in the meantime, let's get control over our own border areas, particularly in Mifa, which is now Arunachal Pradesh, more or less. So he argued the other point. And Nehru, in his Hamlet-like way, was trying to, kind of reconcile both positions and never quite did. But he came down on the side of Panikkar in those days. So we lost, you're right, we lost those first 5 years. Interestingly, the Chinese had the exact same problem. They had a sooner school represented by some by some Tibetan officials and some other cartographers and historians who said, no, now is the time to talk to the Indians, right now. Let's get on with it. We have a strong case. But the politicals, that is Zhou Enlai and Mao, they felt they weren't ready. They were still consolidating themselves internally after coming to power, and I think we forget that they still face significant internal turmoil. So and they didn't have control over Tibet until 54 completely, and even there was rebellion in 55. But so both sides, they didn't have the maps easily. They couldn't access them. Many of the maps were in London, and S. Gopal, the historian, had to go and get them, and he only came back in 1956 and really briefed Nehru on our case on Aksai Chin, and so on. So, there was a lost opportunity there. And then after that, I think things just sharpened and sharpened. Partly, this 5 years of not raising the issue raised some kind of sense of sort of suspicion on both sides, which was like, oh, why aren't they raising the issue? What tricky game are they up to? And then subsequently, the equivocations on both sides were read as attempts to mislead the other, whereas it seems to me at least a good portion of it was they still weren't quite sure of their case, and they were working through it. But each thought that the other had a trick card up their sleeve or was lying. And then, by 56, 57, 58, it was probably just too late.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks both again. We'll now go to Mr. Jagatveer Singh. Just a point here, Mr. Singh, I know your question is quite long in the Q&A box. I'd ask you to please keep it a little shorter if possible. And also, this is the last video question I'll be taking. After this, I'll try and synthesize a couple of other questions we have and just put them to you directly, Kanti. That's okay.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Kanti. It's a privilege listening to you today. So I've got two questions. I'll try and make them short. The first relates to collusivity between Pakistan and China. As you're well aware, in 65, we were warned of the threat from China and Pakistan together for the first time by the Americans. In 1971, Nixon actually called the UN, the Chinese ambassador to the UN when we were entering Bangladesh to threaten us from the north. Today, per se, with the development of the CPEC and the MSR, our northern borders are actually held in a pincer. The only thing jutting out is Siachen. Otherwise, there'd be even a closer connect. So there's exchange of technology, exchange of economics, exchange of military, and with greater infrastructure being developed, how do you see us getting out of this problem, and how do you see this collusivity developing, and will it take place in Afghanistan now with the US pulling out? And the second question I've got is to do with the rise of China, which was fueled by the US to an extent, and which Graham Allison has talked about in his book called Destined for War, when he talks about the Thucydides trap. So where do you see India when this sort of clash between these two countries takes place, which is emerging in a sort of trade war now and may emerge in other manners later? Thank you.
Thanks, Jagadish. I mean, on the first one, I think it's true that, of course, what's the phrase? They are deeper than the deepest ocean together, and sweeter than the sweetest something together, and so on. That is China and Pakistan. But that hides a few things. It does hide that from time to time, China has kind of drifted away to a more neutral position. I'm not saying altogether neutral as between India and Pakistan, but they've drifted into a more middle ground. And on Kashmir, for instance, indicated that it's up to the two of you to sort out. We won't take sides. Please make it peaceful. We're happy with whatever resolution, et cetera, et cetera. To some extent, they've even, at various times during Kargil, for instance, told the Pakistanis that they don't like their actions and they should go easy. At critical moments, both in 65 and 71, despite some, especially in 65, mouthing off at India about how they might intervene, what's striking actually is that they were the dogs that didn't bark. I mean, they didn't intervene, and that's significant, nor did they do it, of course, in 1999. So for all the bark of the Chinese, and I don't know why I'm invoking all these dog metaphors, but anyway, I mean, please excuse me for doing that. They played much less of a role at some level than sometimes we think that they play. Of course, they have transferred missile and nuclear technology. There's no doubt about it. In several talks, I've been asked why that wasn't the fifth P in the book, the Pakistan relationship, because I think that it's more effect than cause. I mean, Pakistan, they're close to Pakistan because they have a problem with us. It's not that they have a problem with us because they're close to Pakistan. So I don't really deal with Pakistan too much. But I think it's worth pointing out, which is unsettling for the longer term in a way, and that is that the Chinese have an interest in Pakistan that goes beyond India, that goes beyond needling India and having a proxy that distracts us and balances us locally, and it splits our forces. And those reasons have to do with Pakistan is a very prominent country in the Muslim world. China has a problem in Xinjiang. And they want the Pakistanis on side. They want Central Asia on side. They want Afghanistan on side and the Muslim world on side. And they do hope and use the Pakistanis as a connect to the Muslim world and as a corrective against those who might be anti-Chinese or anti-Chinese policies. So that's one reason. Historically, at least at a certain point, of course, they were ranged against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan with the Americans too. So they were an ally, but looking at the other direction, not against India, but looking at the Soviet Union. They like the Americans, they saw Pakistan's location as pivotal for a larger geopolitical battle that had nothing to do with India. So that's a second problem. A second reason for the link to Pakistan. The third is that, and that's no longer the case anymore, but we should remember that A.Q. Khan, we think of all the aid that the Chinese gave the Pakistanis in terms of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology and missiles, but the Pakistanis gave them two things. They gave them the Dutch centrifuges that A.Q. Khan stole from the Dutch, which they didn't have. China didn't have that technology. So there was a repayment there. And the other is, here the evidence a bit more mixed, but almost certainly the Pakistanis who had had various types of American equipment, especially aircraft, allowed the Chinese access, contra their agreement with the Americans, which is that you will not share this with other states. They allowed the Chinese to open up the stuff, to look it over, and to try and reverse engineer from it. So, the Pakistanis have been under it for those kinds of things as well. And of course, I mean, since someone mentioned, I think you mentioned it, they were conduit for Kissinger to go up to for the rapprochement with China in 1971. So they've been very useful, and that had nothing to do with India. It had everything to do with the opening to the United States. So this is troubling, I say, because it means that the Chinese will have an interest in Pakistan for a very long time for more enduring reasons. And that's always going to be a problem for us, because they're not going to allow us to get too rough with the Pakistanis or to allow the Pakistanis to collapse because they have their uses. And by the way, we used to have a dialogue here with our high-ranking Indians and Chinese. The Chinese did claim a few years ago in that dialogue at which I was present that their investment in the CPEC and MSR was an investment in stabilizing Pakistan. Jobs for young men who otherwise could become radicals and extremists and even terrorists. So now one could be cynical about that and of course question that, but they did have a logic there. I mean, just like other countries have. That is, can we stabilize a country that could suddenly radicalize, potentially get into serious trouble internally? And it's not just any country. It's a country that could plateau out at 300 million people with nuclear weapons. If it goes wrong, it's not some small African or Middle Eastern republic that's gone wrong. This is a gigantic state with nuclear weapons. So the Chinese, not unaware of the fact that Pakistan can be a big problem for them as well. So let me just...
Yeah, thanks, Kanti.
Thank you.
And thanks, Mr. Singh, for your question. Last couple of questions then, which I'm going to try and sort of handle. Kanti, we have a couple of questions on COVID, unsurprisingly, and including from my batchmate, Samay Mangalgiri. What I'll ask you is, in your book, I mean, you talk about the right that China has an upper hand even in soft power, and I think that surprised a lot of people. To what extent does COVID complicate that story, particularly now that there's increasing scrutiny about how the virus originated and how it escaped, say from the lab? It's one thing for Trump to call it the China virus, but it's another thing altogether for the Biden administration also to be looking into, the origins of the virus. So what, does COVID-19 in some way undermine China's efforts to cultivate this image of itself on a global stage?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not really addressed in the book, so thanks for that. And Samay, nice to see you online, and thanks very much for that thoughtful question. I think, obviously, initially it was disastrous for Beijing because of the outbreak in Wuhan, their mishandling of it, their lack of transparency, which undoubtedly led to its spread. But as against that, many countries looking at China are also grudgingly accepting that they did control it far better than the West, far better, sadly, than India in the second wave, far better than Southeast Asian countries neighboring Japan now, and even Taiwan's having a problem. So, I think there's kind of grudging admiration there for subsequently. I mean, the story is not over yet. We're seeing something of the pendulum swinging back towards the West in the sense that the massive vaccination programs in the Anglo-Saxon countries may be paying off. People now may be able to, we may head towards herd immunity, partly because of exposure, partly because of vaccination together. And in that sense, East Asia, which had this great success on the Chinese model of lockdowns and sequestering people, may yet come out not looking so good because they may not vaccinate as quickly. And if they do open up, then it's going to take off, especially with the variants. And this is the place that Singapore is struggling with now, in a sense, also. So the game's not over, but I would say that it's gone through phases where China looked very bad and was losing soft power. Then it's got to a phase where they gained a lot of admiration, grudgingly, mixed with some anger and resentment, obviously. And we'll see what happens in the third phase. But I saw some recent survey data, including in Southeast Asia, which shows that, there has been respect and admiration looking up to China for the way it controlled it. It's developed its own vaccines. They're not great, apparently, but still, they've been sending them out. So countries have been grateful so far. Whether they remain grateful when they find out that the efficacy is 50%, I'm not so sure. But so the story is not over. But I think it's a mixed one. Where does India come out? I mean, I think there was a moment where two things happened which were very good for India's story. One was, the vaccine capital of the world kind of story, or the vaccine factory of the world, which went bad, sadly. Maybe we'll recover. I'm a bit hopeful now. And the second one was that despite the infectivity and so on in the first wave, I think the figures are not believable, obviously. I mean, the Indian official figures are no way believable. But having said that, for 1.3 billion people, it seemed to be low, and the death rate was also very low. Kudos to people and to the hospital staff and all of that. But the second wave was very damaging. I don't think India's image has really recovered from that yet. And in Southeast Asia, there's some data to show that, when people were asked, how do you look up to India on this COVID thing? And they were like 0% looked up to India, sadly. Whereas China, 30-40% still did look up to China for leadership in this area. So I think that's not an accurate, it's not fair. India could still be a vaccine producer for many, many countries, but the perceptions count. They may be right or they may be wrong. But the existential fact is that we haven't done well out of it. The hopeful part, I mean, I don't wish the Chinese ill. I don't obviously wish them ill, but it would be nice to see India recover in the next phase. Its credibility on how it handles it, and its ability to vaccinate and to get vaccines out to needy people all over the world.
Thanks for that. We have a question from Imran Afridi on China's treatment of the Uyghurs. He asks whether the Chinese are using it as a bargaining chip with the Middle Eastern countries. I'm not sure bargaining chip may be the best word for this, but how does the reports of what's happening in Xinjiang province affect China's soft power? And to that, I'll just add one other question, which is, increasingly aggressive posturing by Chinese diplomats, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. How does this affect Chinese soft power vis-a-vis India?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, this is something I wanted to underline a bit, which I haven't managed to do in some of the earlier sessions because I didn't quite get to it and because my brain doesn't work quickly enough. But on the soft power issue, I just want to make one point, which I don't make very cleanly in the book. And that is that I'm comparing India and China on the soft power. That doesn't mean that China's soft power beats everyone's soft power. The other day I got beaten up a little bit, quite rightly, in one of the sessions in a nice way on this issue. And what I failed to say at that time was that, it remains true, I think even now, that China scores over India in soft power, but that doesn't mean it scores over everyone. In Southeast Asia, it doesn't score over Japan, for sure. It doesn't score over America on all dimensions of soft power either. Or other Western countries or other Asian countries, but it scores over India, mostly, sadly for us. So having said that, get back to the question about Uyghurs and the Muslim world. I mean, I think, the Chinese have handled that rather astutely. I mean, we would think that they would do very badly with their interlocutors in the Muslim world. But this brings me to a bit of a conceptual point. Relating to the different dimensions of power and how they affect each other. So you remember I said earlier, there's hard power, which you bifurcate into military power and economic power, and then there's soft power, the power of attraction and persuasion. These three play off each other. I mean, it would be rather foolish to argue that, except for countries maybe like Sweden and Norway, good citizens of the world all around, that you can really have soft power on any scale if you don't have economic power or military power or both. Then you have very hollow kinds of soft power. Likewise, the reverse kind of is true, which is that soft power is a backstop in a way to hard power, economic and military, in the sense that if you have soft power, you can get your way without, beating people up militarily and using your military resources or your economic kind of heft. So you conserve those for the battles you really need to fight, when you have to absolutely do so, and you use soft power more efficiently in the meantime. So it seems to me that, what the Chinese have done quite successfully vis-a-vis the Muslim world is that, the enormousness of their power, their hard power, economic and military, particularly economic, has really, in a sense, deflected, any hits they've taken on soft power, which is, over their treatment of Uyghurs. And there are a couple of things to say. One, for all outsiders, it's still quite hard to get down to the facts per se, Of course, there's some pretty good pictures and accounts of these detention camps, and I don't want to minimize those at all. But the larger claim about, well, it's oversold, that issue, it's not as bad, and the region is booming economically, people are much better off, as in Tibet, than they ever were, and so on and so forth. That allows the Chinese to introduce a degree of ambivalence into the thinking of the Muslim world, and then, of course, the Muslim world has to compare China to other countries, where how are Muslims being treated in other places, and maybe the Chinese are not so bad compared to the others. By the way, the Muslim world has to think about its own treatment of Muslims, Shia, Sunni, Shia, other Muslims, or other factions or groups. So, there are vulnerabilities and self-doubts there. Plus, China is a massive market. They educate students from abroad who go there, and they buy their goods and so on. So, it's not that easy to, just as the Muslims of the world beyond a point cannot, tilt against the Western world. Now we're finding they can't tilt against China either. And by the way, I would say, much as sometimes we mishandle things, we haven't done so badly in the Muslim world ourselves, despite things like communalism in India, despite maybe Article 370 revocation, despite other issues, our difficulties with Pakistan, sometimes with Bangladesh in the past. So, that's the narcotic of power in a way. If you have it, even those who don't like you very much have to suck it up. And I think the Muslim world, their own weakness means that there are some things they just have to put up and shut up with. And that may be the case with the Uyghurs and the treatment of Muslims in China. And by the way, not all Muslims in China are Uyghurs. So they're the Hui and others who are somewhat differently treated.
Right. And a final set of questions, Kanti, about partnerships, which we really haven't touched on that much in this session. One is from Shikhar Singh. Shikhar Singh asks, why has Russia been able to be friends with China recently? And, how does that have a bearing on our relationship with the Russians and the Chinese? That's one question. And another set of questions is about the Quad, and to what extent, to the extent that the Chinese respect strength and disdain weakness, to what extent will the success of India's strategic initiatives like the Quad paradoxically improve our relationship with the Chinese? So you can take them in whichever order you like, but those are the sort of questions we have.
All right, so shout out to Shikhar, who I haven't seen for a very long time, but great to know that he's listening in, and thanks for the question, Shikhar. The Russia issue, just to go back a little bit, the kind of détente with the Russians, the Soviet Union in those days, goes back to, the early 1980s. So, this movement between the two, the convergence and reconciliation, well, reconciliation first and then convergence, goes back to the early 80s, and we tend to forget it. And by the way, it was paralleled by our reconciliation and convergence, the beginnings of it with the United States on the other side, and to some extent with China too, by the way. The border talks began in 1981-82, just about that time with China, the first restart of the border talks after 1962. So there was a general climate of reconciliation between all the members of that Quad, the Soviet Union, China, the United States, and India at that time. And I think, looking back on it, we didn't see it. I was in America as a grad student then, like Shikhar is now, I presume, and we didn't get it. That the cooling down of the Cold War had occurred, and it was already in process. And by 86, 87, with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, it was almost, it was almost there. The events of 1989 were already prefigured. And so from about the 1980s onwards, 81, 82, China and the Soviet Union and then Russia converged. It's a factoid that the Chinese were importing arms from the Soviets, if I recall, even during the time when they were close allies of the United States and against the Soviets, because they had Soviet systems. So there was some traffic even of arms, which is quite peculiar. But coming to the larger question, I mean, obviously it kind of makes sense that with China looking at a very powerful, rampant America after the Cold War, and the Soviets, Russians looking out at the Americans as well. I mean, initially, Moscow was looking for a dignified membership in the West, that Bush and others would give it. Sadly, that didn't happen. NATO expansion happened instead. And there's quite a story about, whether the Americans screwed it up or the Russians suddenly turned nationalist again. But the fact is they got alienated from the Americans relatively quickly. And they looked to the Chinese, therefore, partly to kind of, thumb their noses at the Americans. And to do what many countries do, including India, when they're trapped between two big powers, when you're relatively weak, which is that you sit in that middle ground, threatening to defect to either side to try and utilize that threat of defection to your advantage. So the implicit message to the Americans was, don't push us too much, otherwise we'll go into almost a formal alliance with the Chinese. And the message to the Chinese, which I think still exists, is, if Beijing takes Moscow too much for granted, we'll move back towards the West. So, it gives Moscow a bargaining space there. Now, of course, it didn't work with the Americans too well at that time, because the Americans sort of said, we don't give a damn, you're so weak that you're no adornment to the Chinese. In fact, you'll be a burden to the Chinese. But Russia has recovered since then, and they're very important for China in several ways. They distract the Americans now in the West, in Western Europe. They do have a refurbished military. They have thousands of nuclear weapons. And they have energy power that they use against the Europeans. They drive a wedge often across the Atlantic, between the Atlantic partners. Well, that's music to China's ears. Russia also means that China can focus the other way. With the Russians taking care of business one side and not threatening the Chinese on their massive border, the Chinese are free to look to East Asia and to their west, which is India, you see. So the Russians have freed up their power to look east and to look west for the Chinese. That's a very important thing they've done. So the Russians gain, Chinese buy their goods, their weaponry, give them respect and dignity in the way that NATO and the Americans didn't, and are quasi-alliance partners. I mean, so I think those are the reasons that they really look to each other. Of course, Moscow's a bit stuck between India and China, because they also want to remind the Chinese not to take them for granted in another relationship, which is don't take us for granted vis-a-vis Delhi, and they happily sell weaponry to us as well, including very leading systems. So the Moscow under Putin is playing a very clever hand, and a rather successful one. I mean, his economy is smaller than Germany's, but his foreign policy profile is global almost, So kudos to him, even though he's not my favorite person. Sorry, there was the Quad. Yeah, the Quad is interesting. I mean, there's one school of thought in India that, we get into trouble with the Chinese when we get too close to the Americans and, these putative partners. That's exactly when the Chinese get obstreperous with us. The other is that, no, when we swing the other side, that's when the Chinese start playing nice. And I don't know, it's a hard one to sort out. I mean, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I would say that on the whole, regardless, India has no place to go at the moment. The power gap is enormous economically. There's a situation in Ladakh in particular. This strengthens our bargaining hand with the Chinese, no doubt about it, I think, for the moment. But India is playing quite a clever hand. I mean, Modi came here to the Shangri-La dialogue in 2018, and in that speech on the Indo-Pacific, he said, which raised eyebrows everywhere, that, the free and open Indo-Pacific, we're all for it, but it's a free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. which was a kind of gesture to Xi Jinping and China, meaning, you could be part of a putative Indo-Pacific. Somebody told me that when the Japanese heard it, they fell out of bed because they thought they had Modi on side as this great partner. And a lot of people in Southeast Asia, they were left scratching their heads too, probably the Americans as well to some extent. So, India has not completely committed to the Quad, to the Indo-Pacific. Anyway, the Indo-Pacific idea is more infrastructure, increasing and improving the depth of, of market mechanisms in the region, dealing with environmental issues with partners in this region, Southeast Asian countries. It's not really much of a military diplomatic grouping. The Quad is more the executive military arm of the free and open Indo-Pacific. But even there's a tension point. India is being tabbed as the weak link because it equivocates somewhat, because it's the only country with this live land border with China of the four. But also because India, has to look at the economic relationship and, has a good sense of its own kind of strategic autonomy. It doesn't want to be a junior partner to the Americans or anybody else. But it does mean that from the Quad's point of view, India is a bit doubtful sometimes. And India has also flagged that it's primarily interested in the maritime domain in the Bay of Bengal and in the Arabian Sea area of the Indian Ocean. It's not that interested in sailing its ships into the South China Sea, which is where the Quad would like India to fly its flag. So we've steadfastly refused to joint patrol, but so have the other Quad members with the Americans. So we don't get too provocative in the South China Sea. It's just too far, and we don't have the projection. So I would say that it's a useful grouping to use to strengthen our bargaining hand with the Chinese. I think the Chinese are not overly worried about it. If it gives us some comfort and confidence in dealing with them, I think it's inevitable that we'll cultivate it. The real thing there is the America relationship. The others don't count for all that much. Yeah.
All right, Kanti.
Last point there, the Europeans as honorary members of a putative Quad, that's already being talked about, and the French and the British are now going to, and even the Germans are going to start sailing into the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean. So India would be more comfortable in a Quad plus, I suspect, than it is in a Quad narrow.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, Kanti, thanks a lot for that. That was exhaustive. We covered a lot of ground. There's still a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
But I just think we're out of time, unfortunately.
And there's the football coming in.
And there's the football, which I think may have started. So I will hand over now to the Vice President of DSOBS to take over. Sir, if you could go ahead, please.
Thanks, Ashish.
Good evening, sir. How are you?
Very good. Good to see you.
Thank you, Ashish.
Welcome.
Sorry, couldn't join you at the beginning. But thank you so much. It's been a most informative talk, and I think we've had a record participation this time, sir, in our DOSCOTalks. I think the topic has been most interesting, and everyone's been eagerly been waiting for this talk. But thank you so much. Thank you, Ashish. Thank you, Yash. We can't see you. I hope he's around.
I'm there. Thank you.
Okay, so as usual, just to add a bit of gesture, Neha, if you could put up a picture of, the one I had sent you. So this is in your time, when Yash was in school.
Oh.
This is probably the yearbook from Tata House.
Oh, I see.
So really, two things. This is Yash is there.
Yeah.
What will he do? Yash will become a BJP activist. When he was in SC form.
Yeah.
Thank you, Neha. So you can remove it. Well, thank you, sir.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for your time. Thank you, Ashish. Over to you, Tarun.
Thanks, Sam. Let me just wrap up very quickly and say, Kanti, thank you very much for a illuminating talk. I think you've covered much more. I have started reading your book. I'm afraid I have not finished it as yet, but you've covered a lot more, I suspect, than material that you have in your book, and I really do appreciate that. You have so much experience in the field. There is so much to talk about. It's so topical. And there's such a great deal of interest. We could do perhaps another 2 or 3 sessions like this and still not cover anything. So, perhaps we can get back in touch with you and persuade you, get Yash to persuade you, perhaps to take out some more time to share with us, to scratch the surface even further. So thank you very much. I know that this was well beyond the hour that you had given us, and we really do appreciate it. Record attendance, as Sam had said. Ashish, thank you very much. You've done a stupendous job moderating this talk, and to make it so inclusive, to make sure that everybody came on screen, got to address the questions directly to our headmaster. Really wonderful. And thank you again to everybody for attending. I do want to give a shout out to my headmaster when I was in school, Mr. Shomi Das, who's also on the call today. So, we've had wonderful participation today. Thank you again, Kanti. Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you.
One slightly emotional thing, and then I'll sign off. In my B form, I came back from the hockey field at Skinner's and crossed over the main field. And as I was going up the ramp past H House towards the then tennis courts and back to Tata House, I don't know, the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I turned around and looked back over the main field, and the sun was starting to go down. And I just had one of those moments when you identify with the whole universe. I think the Christians call it an epiphany. And I just felt like I belong to the universe, and the universe belongs to me. And the school was kind of the universe for me. And I just have that memory very deeply, and my attachment to the school. And I just knew in that moment that Doon School would always be somewhere in my life very deeply. And so with that, just thank you very much for doing this and allowing me to come back from this distance to see familiar faces and others, and to be part of the school again. Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Bye.